all of us know that the pandemic has had disproportionate impacts on women and girls. But I think as we go into the second wave, these impacts are just going to get worse, particularly in terms of job losses. The early estimates that are coming from the CMI data in this year, in 2021, are quite dismal. How should we start thinking through in building back better, particularly for women and girls in India? But as I invite the panelists to speak, how should we also think through these measures? What is immediate, like what needs to be done in the short term, what is more medium, and what definitely needs to be done in the long run as we start thinking through women, and, what needs to be done for women and girls. So I'll just invite Ashwini to speak, and then Yamini and Deepa in that order, if that's okay. Ashwini, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Soumya. Uh, the CMI data, which looks at month by month changes in employment, is, as you said, pretty dismal. There was a slight sort of hope of optimism in September of 2020 that women's employment was sort of on a rising track. But after that, it's really not been rising at all. There have been a few fluctuations, but overall, it seems that we are pretty much back to the pre-pandemic gender gaps, and perhaps even going down further. I mean, the gaps are widening further from where we were already in the pre-pandemic situation. So now the problem about the issue about jobs is that there were already very significant disparities in labor market access between men and women. And the pandemic threatens to make them worse, but even if it didn't, we still would have a problem. So as you said, we have to think in terms of what is the immediate impacts of the pandemic that need to be reversed, but also more systematically about how to eliminate or reduce the gender gaps in jobs. And I guess we'll come back to the sort of longer term questions later. But even when you think of the immediate impact of the pandemic, income shocks that have resulted from widespread unemployment of both men and women have had other gendered impacts that have not been noticed as much. So, for example, in CEDA, we carried a story on how women who had benefited from the Ujjwala scheme, that who had these cylinders, they have to return the cylinders because the price of the LPG cylinder has increased from 594 in November, which already was pretty high, to now over 800 in April of 2021. Now, this has a direct impact on the health and nutritional status of families. So the whole point about promoting LPG cylinders is that it reduces indoor air pollution, it reduces the time spent on collection of cooking fuel and time spent on cooking itself. So a major constraint that prevents women from entering the labor force, which is the predominant responsibility of doing household chores, immediately is threatened as a result of this increase in the price of LPG cylinders. So it sounds like a small thing, but actually it has multiplier effects on a range of outcomes that are going to be adverse for women. Health impacts, cooking time impacts, time spent in gathering cooking fuel, and all of that. So it's a one immediate policy measure that can be addressed, and it's actionable. We are not talking about let's change gender attitudes toward discrimination, which we absolutely must, but people might say that that's not very actionable right now. But Ujjwala scheme or the LPG price cylinder is extremely actionable, right? So that's something that we need to take into account. In terms of health workers, Deepa is here, so I'm not going to spend time on talking about health workers because her work is very seminal here. But again, something which has an immediate impact and which is actionable in the payment to the health workers, because most of them are women. The other is just the mental health consequences of being a health worker, especially during the second wave, when they have had to deal with deaths, breaking the news to bereaved families, handling the stress and isolation, the stigma which carries over from the first wave. These are some of the points where we can immediately intervene. By we, I mean the state and society as a whole, can immediately intervene and stem the adverse consequences that could be disastrous. So I would say, in the immediate short term, let's focus on actionable points and not losing sight of changes that have to be brought about to address long standing issues of gender inequality. Let me stop there and then we can return to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Ashwini. Really interesting insights. Yamini, I know that, from a Gates perspective, there's been a lot of emphasis on women in the informal workforce as well. For example, the work that you've been doing with Seva, and also, equally women who might be in the informal economy, but might be members of collectives, and the work that the foundation does with NRLM, in which case the collectives have really responded to the situation. But what is the sort of overall thinking on how we can use these platforms like collectives to build back better, and what might be the immediate sort of gaps that might be seen, particularly even for women in the informal economy?
Okay. Thanks, Soumya. So I'd like to just respond a little bit, building on Ashwini's points, and then move to the collectives piece. I mean, one overall sort of fear for me is that we transfer the burden of recovery and all that hard work also onto unpaid women in collectives, right? So you don't want to increase women's community and voluntary work while they're already backsliding and barely sort of managing to keep their households moving. So I think that is a very overarching something that we should remember, so that we're not just outsourcing everything to self-help groups, but at the same time, as you say, recognize that there is something in that social capital and these sort of solidarity networks that could help mitigate some of the extreme negative impacts of the shocks. And I think I have a couple of ideas that I'm happy to share. But I think, just building on Ashwini's point, I mean, the thing to recognize is just how bad things are. How bad things are for the poor, how bad things are for all the poor, and definitely for specific vulnerable segments therein, minorities, those who are already, as you say, in informal work, but also who go in and out of even informal work historically. And within that, women and children. I mean, there's certainly, there's a framing that we need to have, that either you call, think in terms of vulnerability or marginalized communities, but we just have to have a really fresh way of thinking, and especially thinking about inequities, right? And within that, I think we also have to have a really new way of bringing together health and economic work. And I'm sure Deepa will say more about this, but for me, health is very much part of that human capital. And if we're seeing so many health morbidities and health systems on the one side, and health morbidities on the population side, with so many supply gaps and so on, just exacerbating the situation, I think it's going to just exponentially worsen how things are for those already affected by the pandemic, directly or indirectly. And I think that just is all of us, and certainly a few of us will remain resilient. But I think that framework really needs to be very clear in our minds, that it's not health system in the short term that you try to vaccinate everyone or mitigate sort of the health impacts of those suffering from COVID, which is necessarily a short term and a very, very critical focus that needs to be there. But health as human capital, health, nutrition, we need to just make sure that that never goes out of focus for us. Now, in terms of I think the um, related to that is the nutrition insecurity and food insecurity question that has hit us in a very, very big way. And again, this is Deepa's forte, and I've learned so much just from reading her work, so I won't profess to be an expert on this. But it feels to me that within that economic framing, again, we have to bring in food insecurity, and as to add to Ashwini's, income insecurity and work sort of access that's there. So it's sort of this 3 or 4 pronged framing that we need to really think about. Now, and I think there are 3 or 4 figures that have emerged for us as the critical actors in this, who are both, helping a lot of our communities survive, but also, ensuring we get essential services. And that's the health worker, the service delivery person. So again, your informality and the gig economy sort of tie in there. Sanitation workers, and I think that whole range of frontline workers, we must really make sure that it's comprehensive and now not forgetting any of the actors therein. And having said that, I think the last one is this overarching migrant worker, right? And migration is something that comes and goes within our purview as we think through economic development. But now is the time to really sit and understand how does migration happen, and how is this hit both migration as a strategy for households to access economic resources, but also now what is happening both in the rural and the urban, given that we just don't know. This is a sort of an unknown, very very unknown sort of immediate future, and this, given the scale of the shock that we are experiencing. Now, in terms of collectives, I think there's quite a bit of work out there already, including work that you all, Saumya, and your team have led, some work that Ashwini's that's just come out. I think the importance of social capital, which ironically, given all the social distancing that this pandemic has necessitated, I think that sense of community and solidarity becomes even more important, even if we are removing the physical act of groups coming together. It There are other things that those groups come together on, and those remain very very important. And that's your networks in order to access safety nets, your networks to help you tide through really terrible times, health expenditure, food insecurity, but also just emotional support. I think Ashwini talked about mental health. So I think there's multiple things that groups and collectivization helps us, and has certainly helped the poor. Now, what's possible within that in the very short term, I think just thinking through, how do those survive? I mean, you're talking about, microcredit groups, if you talk about NRLM, as you mentioned, Soumya, but also others, right? You're talking about financial inclusion more broadly, and that has to be much broader than credit. It has to be savings, it has to be ways to access the income transfers that are coming in, ways to access entitlements that are coming in. And I think there the collectives can play a really strong role. This is something that's mandated, but I think we have to think through some very smart strategies so that we're not burdening the women to then go with lists and trying to get where's this, where's that, and validate them and so on. So I think there's a way that you can approach them, but it has to be done in a way that supports them rather than cast the burden on them. Secondly, migrant support centers. There are some of these very community based initiatives that are needed at this point in time, and they have to be rooted in the community, given that we don't have a digital India that's comprehensive yet. And so who are these community leaders, these champions, these active, what they call active women and active men in the communities, who are doing the community work and connecting with state markets, etc., etc. I think those need to be really activated and strengthened. And therein there's a role for a collective, village level collective or a block level collective, to really both ensure that no one is left out, but also ensure that these people have some sense of support and connection to some sort of help in terms of being able to do their work, given all the lockdowns and the restrictions on mobility, etc., that otherwise we take for granted. The third would be, I think, just related to that, are these hybrid models of digital and in person, right? Everything can't is not digital, as we've learned, or that it doesn't work purely digitally without human enablement. Now, how do you ensure that that's institutionalized? I think maybe the collectives can be a really powerful platform or medium for us to be able to do this, but it needs inputs and it needs strengthening. The last, of course, is on the social enterprises, collective farming. Like, there's lots of economic models that communities and especially women have already evolved over time in order to both reduce costs, but also pool very very tiny assets in order to access greater capital, greater markets, increase productivity, and so on. And I think those will need to really be looked at, and those will need to be amplified by state action and state investment. So let me stop there before hogging all the time and pass it on to back to you, Soumya, and to Deepa.
Thanks so much, Yamini. And I think you really brought an interesting point. And to what extent can we leverage women's federations, women's own, collectives, especially when they themselves are under such duress? I know that Deepa's also been writing extensively about ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers who've also been playing this role. So Deepa, just, over to you to, if you could throw some light on, we all know that in the short term, of course, there's this huge food insecurity and nutrition and anemia related. I mean, we're not even talking about adolescent girls here, on what sort of health effects that this would be having, including on their mental health. There's also this whole added responsibility of IC campaigns around vaccination and social distancing. And, of course, the ASHA and Anganwadi workers having to play that role. But equally, Deepa, in your work, you've been highlighting that how they've been underpaid. And of course, they're still considered quote unquote honorary workers, and that they don't even have full-time jobs or any social security benefits. And the multiplier effects of actually giving them those jobs, because, the moment you get a formal job, then you're also, providing a fiscal stimulus in a way. So, Deepa, if you could throw on light on all of these issues. And one last thing that I wanted to ask you was also on RCH, the reproductive and child health, because that seems to have really taken a hit. There have been studies to show that, again, the ASHA workers might be very critical, a chain in, that whole human enablement to get these women to centers. And we don't even know the kind of effects that food insecurity, as well as just lack of access to reproductive care, has had on an entire generation of women or a cohort of women, particularly now. So, Deepa, over to you.
Thanks, Soumya. So I'll just briefly speak both the frontline workers and food security, I think. I want to start with what Ashwini and Yamini said, that this whole livelihood crisis, what is even more frustrating is that the government seems to be in denial this time around. Last time you had migrants walking, you had the media covering this. Now we are so overwhelmed by the COVID crisis, which is quite serious, that this whole issue of its impact on livelihood and food security has been completely ignored. So a number of relief schemes or measures that were announced last year, even focused on women, we don't have this time. Free cylinder in Ujjwala, you don't have when the prices are increasing. It was a measly amount, but there was some transfer through the Jandan accounts and front loading of the single women pensions and so on. You don't have that. Even the additional 1,000 rupees that ASHA workers were offered for this extra work that they're doing, there's nothing this time. There is no data, it's not clear on ASHA workers affected by COVID, what is happening, are they accessing health? None of this, there have been no measures announced. But over last year's lockdown and later, what we did learn was that first, that using existing schemes, that the welfare mechanism that our country has with many gaps and holes was still fairly effective in reaching the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized. So many studies, field studies, which came out in this period of October to December in 2020, they showed two things. First thing they showed was that unemployment continued and that food security or consumption of food didn't go back to pre-pandemic levels. At the same time, they also showed that, say, the PDS was quite effective in reaching people who had ration cards. We were quite surprised to see that even the ICDS supplementary nutrition, around 60% of the beneficiaries seem to have been getting something in terms of take-home rations and so on. So for me, in terms of short-term, immediate, one easy thing, in my opinion, to do would be to just deliver extra enhanced through these existing mechanisms that are already there. So can the midday meal, for instance, a number of states are doing cash transfers in place of midday meal because schools are closed. But in few states where it is dry rations, you're seeing that it makes a difference, because in the household you have one package of at least some dal and oil and grain going in, which of course reduces the burden on the woman in the household also in trying to put a meal together. Supplementary nutrition and ICDS, again, Delhi, for instance, has a package of laddu and chana and gur. This can be done everywhere, include eggs and so on, because we have the mechanism to do it again. And I think these things are even more important this time because of the rural, the livelihood and food prices, not just the issue of migrants going back, but this time people falling ill. We don't know how much testing is happening. Even by the data that we have, you're seeing that 70% of the cases now are coming from rural districts. And there we know that there are issues in access to health, there is out of pocket expenditures very high, and so there is that additional burden as well. So focusing on rural areas, Narega, these are all programs we know are equitable in design, because we do know from coverage that at least so far Narega has had a good representation of women, Dalit, Adivasis. ICDS coverage, if you look at it, it reaches out more to families from disadvantaged communities. Midday meal is in government schools largely, again, Dalit Adivasi girl children who are going to government schools. So using these programs to reach out to people to provide social protection, I think is extremely important and something that is not being talked about at all. On top of this, of course, is the frontline worker issue. Like I was saying, the additional incentive which was offered last time is not there this time. There is also one whole group of women who are not addressed, which is the midday meal cooks and helpers. There are 25 lakh women who are employed as midday meal cooks and helpers. With the schools being closed and cooked meal not being happening, they've not been paid for over a year now. But there is again this cadre of workers who can be used to maybe do community kitchens in the villages, deliver, like Kerala delivered cooked food to children in rural areas. Similarly, NRLM, how can we think of, and these can be short term, income generating activities of making masks, making soaps. We are seeing that these are not there, they are in short supply in rural areas. So even the simple cloth masks, one is not there everywhere. And finally, just the last issue that I want to mention, which Soumya, you did talk about, is the disruption in the regular health services. Again, something that we don't know the impact of, and regular health as well as nutrition services. Last year, we did a survey of about 1,100 people through the Right to Food campaign network to look at what was happening to maternity entitlements under the Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana. And there again, we saw that about 80% of the women were registered in the Anganwadi center. The pregnancies were registered, but only 20% had received even one installment of the PMM VY. It's a 5,000 rupees small amount, but it's a simple thing. You have the women, you have their names, you have their bank account details. You just have to front load transfer that installment into their accounts. Not being done. Regular ANC, growth monitoring, nutrition, health education, all these services are disrupted. And they'll definitely have an impact in outcomes, especially in this context where household food security is also poor. Here again, in all of these, data gaps is the last issue that I want to raise, that to do any of this, there is no monitoring data that is at least being put out publicly. Maybe the government has it, we don't know, but what is the coverage? Where is the NRHM MIS? Where is the Poshan MIS? And how is this being used to reach out to that last girl and the last woman is something that is not being reviewed. And it's a shame because this is happening over a year now. So it's not like last time we were caught unawares. Now it's been there, people have been writing, there's so much we know that women are more affected in so many ways, but still you don't see any gendered kind of policy coming.
Thanks, Deepa. No, those are very sobering insights, particularly on how we are actually losing the plot, perhaps in the second wave, which might actually be much more threatening. I'll just go back to Ashwini on a couple of points, Yamini, that you and Deepa also raised. Ashwini, one is, of course, within women, you're seeing these vulnerable women who might be belonging to minorities and, the Dalit and Adivasi groups. And as Deepa was saying, schemes which we know are schemes either because, they just reach the poorest of the poor and the upper castes and whatever probably, leave these schemes and actually go in for private sort of expenses. But they reach them, and have they been impacted disproportionately more so than other women, given your work, particularly with SC women and ST women, research around that? And I think the second thing was on the collectives that we have been talking about in NRLM. I know you just came out with a paper on Maharashtra, and I think it touches upon the point that Yamini made, that of course there was initially when they were conceptualized, there was an idea that of course they would further women's livelihoods and economic empowerment. Now in certain cases, are we seeing positive spillovers of actual social solidarity, which is perhaps the only sort of mechanism that's available, say, to take care of heightened domestic violence. You have some networks to rely on to talk about those sort of issues, and of course leverage them for other work, at least within women's groups. So if you could talk about marginalized women, vulnerable groups within women, as well as this whole social solidarity of collectives. That
Yeah, thanks, Soumya. So, on the first question of intersectionality or marginalized groups within women, if I'll take off from the point that Deepa ended with, which is the lack of data. So, we need, in order to address any of these issues, we have to recognize that these are problems and that these are problems that we ought to be concerned about. I don't see a sufficient recognition from the state apparatus that, forget about the gendered impacts, even the impacts of the pandemic on the population. I mean, there was pandemic denial. There was a denial of the second wave to start with. So we have many challenges in terms of delivering relief. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, okay, the pandemic is real, but there are vulnerable populations that need relief, and that brings us to Deepa's, the list of schemes that she pointed out, which is actually, these are very easy to execute steps. But why is it that we don't see those steps being taken? And I think that's where the denial comes. The third is the gendered impacts. And I don't know if there is a sufficient recognition of the gendered impacts. Certainly not within those who are at the helm of decision making. And which is linked to the fact that not enough women are in decision making positions to begin with. But it's not automatic. I'm not saying that if there were only women, all of these problems would be recognized, because you need a deeper social awareness of inequalities, which is not only a function of having women, but having women would have helped at this point, and we don't have enough women in decision making. Coming then to the intersectionality, when you think of the pre-existing labor gaps, yes, there is work, including mine and many other people's, where we've talked about intersectionality. But to understand the precise contours of the impact of the pandemic differentially on vulnerable groups within women, I think we need data in real time. And unfortunately, that a lot of that data is not forthcoming. I mean, there is some from CMIE, but again, if you look at their scheduled tribe sample, it's not very big compared to how big their sample is, predominantly urban, etc. So there are challenges. And so I think overall, we are relying on, survey data of the kind that the Azim Premji University State of Working India report has put out. And that's a very useful document for us to go forward. But I think there's no doubt that the impact is disproportionate, that the more vulnerable sections, the more stigmatized sections within women are also bearing the brunt of the pandemic disproportionately. But we do need data in real time to make these analyses quickly. So that's one point. So I'm giving very short bullet point answers. Coming to the question of the SHGs, not only is my paper out recently, but I'm also completing a big study for the World Bank, looking at the World Bank's involvement of the last 20 years in this sector. And one of the conclusions that I'm just wrapping it up, actually, I'm giving it in 2 days. One of the conclusions that's a little disturbing from that 20 years experience is that the target of last mile delivery has now been included as an objective of the NRLM. What that means on the ground is that the line departments of different ministries that are supposed to deliver services to the population, the SHG women have been included as delivery agents. Nowhere is this more obvious than the Swachh Bharat mission, where the task of toilet construction was lock, stock, and barrel, given to the SHG members. So while it is SHG membership has enhanced women's empowerment in many dimensions, has created the social capital, has given this feeling of group solidarity, and all of these are extremely positive impacts of NRLM. But if NRLM women are going to be seen as delivery agents of line departments of ministries, that is something that to be worried about, because that adds a huge amount of burden on a group of on half our population, which is women, that are already time poor and income poor. So I did a lot of interviews as a part of this World Bank study, and a respondent told me we should do a time use study of SHG women separately. How are they using their time? And so I think that line departments of ministries have to be held accountable to their own self-service delivery targets, and their work should not be transferred to NRLM, to SHG women. But SHG women have been absolutely the cornerstones of the sort of providing community support as well as material support, as well as support for example, for domestic violence. So I did a small study in Madhya Pradesh, where we interviewed not as NRLM SHGs, but Pradhan SHGs. And our respondents told us that had it not been for the SHGs, many of these issues of food security, domestic violence would have been even more unbearable had it not been for the support provided for the SHG. So it's a complicated scenario, but we always have to be mindful of not increasing the burden on women who are already overburdened with taking care of domestic work, income generation, providing support to the families, and all of these things. So I think that we have to be extremely mindful of that.
Thanks so much, Ashwini. Yamini, over to you. And just drawing from where Ashwini ended on the collectives, I think there's also some recognition, for example, in iWage's own work, where we've been trying to connect women through agency trainings, so that they can recognize what are their entitlements, and they can actually approach institutional platforms that we are piloting, like gender resource centers. But the challenge that even the ministry is recognizing is the cadre who's receiving the training, the CRP, maybe a Samta Sakir or a Badlao Didi or whoever she's called in whatever states, is it her responsibility to give the entitlement, to make sure that she knows exactly how the application works, and take her to the government office or take her to the GRC, or just pass on awareness? Because those are two very different things. And this, even the ministry says that, am I burdening then, a CRP who's really, not being paid for this service, not being trained in this manner? And I think the second question is also, Yami, you've been associated with, and you've been giving a lot of inputs on the state of working India. So we know a lot of interesting data insights have come out, but what is missing? What more needs to be done?
Soumya, so on the collectives front, it is an important question, and we'd have to have a simple answer, right? Otherwise, how do where do you direct sort of some action? And I think the community resource persons, I think the grassroots agent based models that are out there for linking to information and literacy and providing awareness, but also enablement, and I think now the time is to ensure that it happens, right? Like, what's the outcome we want, and what's the gap that you're trying to fill? And so Ashwini's point that, look, there's a whole government machinery out there, which is very well thought out and all the way down. I mean, staffed all the way down to like block levels and panchayat level, right? So So I think there are two ways to think about it. One is you really need the SAG system, and that's both the village organizations, their social action committees, as well as these individual women. I think the individual women are sort of the proxies for an institution, right? I mean, they are the champions who have been provided a lot of investments in terms of training, information, knowledge, maybe some tools, etc. But they are working within a system as well. And so I think we have to take a call on, do we, if they are the ones who are filling that gap, even that last mile gap that exists despite having a lot of last mile staff. Sorry, my child is screaming. um, um, so when you have that last mile gap that's persisting, when you have that last mile gap that's persisting, all right, sure. When you have the last mile gap that seems to persist, and there are community based actors who are able to fill it. I mean, again, you need NGOs sort of building capacity. I mean, there's a whole thing, a set of capitals that are invested there, right? Then I think it's time for us to see how does the state actually, support them financially, as well as because I think the hair splitting in terms of roles feels like now is not the time for us to debate that, but really thinking through, okay, good. But really thinking through how can we make it effective, and how can we make sure that those who are doing the work are not feeling exploited and overburdened without at least some degree of compensation. Now, where will that come from? Is there fiscal space for it? Which program will pay for it? What's the sustainability? Is it short term, medium term? I mean, I think it's a good idea as a follow up for this to really get into that question and see, convene a set of experts, a set of people, and really understand, like, what does it take? Because I think that the last half mile of the last mile is left, right? And that gap is being filled by self-help groups. It's being filled by community champions, community actors, these sakhis that are, a plethora of them there. And I think this is also understanding that the origins of, for example, the workforce, they came out of the community, right? They were community actors who were trying to really build out and, bring both, effective community based monitoring as well as advocacy, and really bringing, highlighting the gaps that are out there. So I almost think that, it's maybe that is the time to sort of see how do you bring out more community based other kinds of actors into this fold, formalize at least the relationships, if not the specific positions, because they are playing that role. And so you don't want them to then go sit in a government office, be asked to sit in a corner because they've brought in 20 women or 20 households entitlements, but then because they're this an informal sort of cadre of women, they say, okay, sit there, we'll come to you, or come after 3 days. I mean, all those things that we know happen to these so I think it would be a bit of I think it's something that we should think through now, because this pandemic, it's not going away. And probably if we are thinking through longer term recovery, while we are thinking of macro picture and employment and labor markets and so on, there's also these kinds of initiatives that are very much required, and that can actually bring in some incomes into the households, but also build out more community based actors who can connect people more easily. So that's sort of the first part of your question. And I think we need to bring in an accountability lens and a self ownership lens, all of those things. But it will require a little bit of thought and a little bit of thinking through what does it mean for policy in the short, medium, long term, and at least in the short and medium terms. And your second question,
And the
remind me
state
what
of
it
working
was.
India, any data like
Oh, the
what?
state of
Yeah.
Look, I mean, this state of working India is, as Ashwini said, it's a great document. I mean, the website also has lots of other background papers that didn't make it into the report itself, that focused on recovery, on COVID impacts and so on. I think, I mean, there are data gaps, right? Like, we know there are data gaps. This tries to make the best of the situation given existing data. And I think it does a great job. It tells us very, very granularly in terms of both what's happening with all of those COVID, packages that, survival and resilience packages that were rolled out last year, the the PM Garib Yojana and others, but also um, it tells you what the gap is. So at least it's a good signal. It tells you, okay, here's, there is inequality, there are gaps, and at least it tells you those things. Certainly covers enterprises. It covers a very, very important understanding of why how women are not getting back into the workforce, right? And that gender gap of even recovery has a very, very steep and widening gender gap. Now, having said that, I mean, everything is not just about data, I think, right? Okay, sorry, everything's not just about data. I think it's also about pulling together what we know from shocks like this, right? Like from crises like this. Okay, now can you please go away? So okay. But understanding that
I
shocks
can
like this have happened. I mean, not of this scale and nature, but shocks do happen. And there are, I mean, we had structural adjustment, we had, a shifting, restructuring of the economy. We've seen a lot of different kinds of, okay, yeah. Sorry, we need our nursery rhymes. I have a very digital toddler. So I think we do need to bring in lessons from other sorts of historical experience. And Chinmay, Tambe has this great book that's just come out that's looking at other pandemics. Ashwini, I think you also wrote a paper looking at what happened with was it the flu pandemic or the Great Plague? So I think there are some of these examples that we should probably bring back. And I guess a little bit of bias in terms of solution, if you're more, to be a little more solution oriented. And so for there, to see what's that set of things that we have already. As Deepa says, lots and lots of programs, implementing them can actually mitigate some of the more negative experiences. But at the same time, what's the gap and what's missing? And for that, having program data is very important, because then it can help you. I mean, you don't need to do new surveys, etc. So if we have admin data, you can actually see the variation and see what's happening within those households. And there are many, many researchers who are interested in this, and certainly donors who would like to support some of these initiatives, because we want quick understandings of what's happening. For example, I'll just because Ashwini brought this gender-based violence example. I mean, we know that there's a whole set of experiments on cash transfers and gender-based violence. Now we're seeing cash going into households. Like, can we have some, not quick like 3 month surveys, but actually track households over time to see what are the multipliers of this? Does it also mitigate and change other sort of gender arrangements? Does it shifting? So I mean, I'm just saying, like, taking advantage of an opportunity like that to really understand what's happening within those households without necessarily setting up large research studies which take like 3 years to set up in any case. So I do think that what I would say, add to stay, I mean, not to maybe in the next state of working India, would be really understanding some of these government policies and programs, and really helping address that gap, and testing what would work to actually mitigate that gap. Now, everything is not evidence based, but that kind of evidence can really help um, you know at least realize the intent of these policies.
Thanks so much, Yamini. Deepa, a question to you. I think particularly as you threw light on the packages that can be activated immediately. I know we've been hearing Jean and others say that even the relief package that was offered last year, if you could just offer that itself again, and it's just been a blank slate this time. And I think, the one point that, we could also think about is actually childcare. And I think the Anganwadi system, at least to some extent in rural areas, tends to alleviate that. Of course, they were closed during the lockdown, but in urban areas, you have no Anganwadi. And that's something to be thought of, because, the urban women's particular workforce participation is absolutely, I think now the estimates were saying, as per CMI data, end of last year was about 7%. So it's really declining rapidly. So any thoughts on childcare as well, on institutional level, this thing? The other question was, of course, Narega is there in rural areas, but there's been calls also for an urban employment guarantee scheme. There have been people who've been talking about it, or even a gender targeted basic income, so that it actually goes, particularly in urban areas. any thoughts on whether that sort of a solution should be piloted or tested?
On the childcare issue, yes, there've been all of us so many working on making universal childcare available, which doesn't mean that every child has to access institutionalized care, but that every mother has access to childcare when she needs it. And like you said, Anganwadis is only a partial solution, and there has been work around community-led creches, converting Anganwadis into creches. There was a proposal in 2011 to convert 5% of ICDS centers into Anganwadi creches. That has not happened. Over the years, the proposal kept increasing. It became 25% of the centers, but it never happened, even the pilot. In fact, if you look at the budgets for the National Creche Scheme, they've been consistently falling over the last 6-7 years. Hardly any budgets now. So it is a big issue, but it's one of the many barriers for women to participate in the labor market, like we know. The whole issue of domestic chores, and again, Ashwini's work in Bengal, and they study where the burden of domestic chores, even more than childcare, came across as something that was a barrier for women. So access to water. So recently we were doing a review meeting of the Delhi Right to Food campaign, and what came out from every community was the issue of access to drinking water, and how difficult it has been now in these few months, and how much women's time is of course going then into that in urban areas. So it's childcare plus water, fuel. We go back to Ujjwala and all that infrastructure, which I don't. The in childcare, what's become tricky now during the pandemic is this whole distancing bit. Although we have been, after a lot of thought, of the view that instead of this blanket national shutdown of Anganwadis, you need to have a slightly more decentralized, flexible strategy depending on the case loads at the block level and even maybe the panchayat level. Many parts of the country, there are no buildings for the Anganwadis anyway. It's happening under the tree, using mask distancing. I mean, be a little more creative. And everywhere, every other country in the world seems to be first thinking of childcare, kindergarten, primary school, and then so on. And here, it's such a education which we are not talking about enough. For over a year, what is happening in rural schools, Anganwadis? Nothing. We know nothing has happened, and the shutting down. I'm now brave enough to put it out and say that shutting down nationally for months on end is definitely not the way forward, and we really need to think about it. The other, which you talked about, is urban employment. Again, absolutely. And we didn't, again, from this public employment study that we did with IVET, Soumya, it came out very clearly from the interviews that a big issue was also the lack of opportunities. It was, one is finding opportunities which you could do along with your household work, but there is no job opportunities anywhere. It doesn't seem to. What is the work that they are able to do, even if you have all of this? And that, of course, raises a lot of macroeconomic questions on job creation as well. So urban employment would have the potential, like Narega, I think, to again do that role of the multiplier and to kickstart the economy in this context where there is no demand, there are no jobs, prices are rising. So Narega expansion, as well as some creative ways of creating urban employment for unskilled, semi-skilled workers would be another big issue. Just one advocacy agenda I'm throwing in here, even though you didn't ask, which came out of our studies again, was hostels for women. And again, not those working women's hostels for middle-class women alone, but living arrangements for women in urban areas to be able to work. It was another big issue.
Thank you so much, Deepak. So I'm just checking. There are not many questions. I think there was one on Asha's, but we have already discussed that. So I think what we can do, we have about 5 minutes remaining. Just go around with the panelists and probably ask them, to play the devil's advocate. And let's say if we are only focusing on short to medium term measures, what could it be? What could those measures be? And of course, including health and vaccination and all of those problems that we're reading about women not being able to access because of digital issues and not having digital literacy or digital access in the first place to be able to register. But besides that, your top three choices for short to medium term. Anyone, I mean, I won't put anybody in the spot, but any of the panelists who would like to go first.
I can go first. So, one of the things that I just heard recently is that some of the factory owners in Delhi are not paying the workers who didn't go back, because they're worried that if they pay them, they'll go back. They'll just take the money and go back. So workers have not been paid for as much as 3 months, because the factory owners want to keep them in Delhi, which of course is challenging because we know, all of the things that we've talked about in terms of supporting services are very slow if they exist at all. So I think payroll support to small and micro enterprises has to be absolutely top of the agenda, because many of the employees themselves are very small employees. They're very marginal in terms of their resource base. So it's not like they're evil necessarily, but they don't even have that margin, to be able to pay when there's no demand, when the factories are not working, etc. So this had been a point that was raised last year by several of us, but it is absolutely top of the agenda, which is to give payroll support to micro and small enterprises, and the government has to step in. I mean, fiscal stimulus of this kind, when you're facing the biggest crisis of the century, it can't be left to individual efforts. It has to be the government, it has to be the central government, because already there are issues of fiscal imbalances between the state government's capacities, and state governments are very variable in terms of their capacities. So at such time, the central government has to step in, and payroll support should be number one. The other is, over the last 10 years, India had made huge progress in terms of girls' education. So the gender gaps in education had been shrinking rapidly. But I think this prolonged school closure and the daycare centers closure that Deepa talked about is going to have adverse impacts on the progress that we made in terms of closing the educational gaps. Because in households, particularly in rural and also in urban areas, young girls who themselves are of school going age end up acting as childcare providers. And when the mothers and the fathers are also distressed, I think we are at a huge risk of reversing the gains made in closing the gender gaps. There is, of course, the gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of access to digital resources, laptops, phones, etc. But when there is only one phone in the household, if that, who's going to get access to it? Is it going to be the girl or is it going to be the boy? So there are already intra-household issues of claim on household resources that we have talked about. Researchers have talked about. I think this pandemic threatens to make that worse. Again, how does one solve it? There has to be a concerted policy to make sure that the pre-existing resource allocation gaps within households, whether it's food, whether it's access to digital resources, whether it's access to any other kind of facility, should not be worsened. But you need to have a mindset for that, and that's what it has to guide policy. And employment guarantee or basic income or whatever it is, I think employment guarantee both for urban and rural areas, Deepa has already talked about it, but I mean that would be my third item. I'm not even going into the health thing because I think that's obvious. Although if it isn't, I'll state it that obviously health infrastructure, and not just about COVID, needs to be paid attention to. We are, in fact, working right now in CEDA, making a graphic from the COVID data, where we see that in terms of vaccine recipients, there is a huge gender gap. Women everywhere, other than Kerala and maybe another state, women have received vaccinations at a lower rate than men have. And so we are just preparing the graphic. It should be out in a couple of days, if not tomorrow. So everywhere you see the gender gaps are are manifesting themselves. So we definitely need an approach which is aware and sensitive to these issues.
Thanks so much, Ashwini, Deepa, Yamini. One of you who would like to go next? Top three short to medium term. Yamini?
I was pointing to Deepa. I'll just maybe keep it very short and say, derivative suggestions. I think urban jobs is huge. Again, very much targeted at women because women's urban employment is just dismal, and getting worse. Secondly, certainly the income transfers and food security initiatives just absolutely need to be, those are very, very important short-term things. Small enterprises, so glad Ashwini brought that up. I think the small enterprises are, I mean, I don't know, like data says 25% have shut down or something. I think that is a huge crisis because that's where a lot of, so definitely measures like wage subsidies, other kinds of subsidies, rental subsidies, like what have you, like debate a few, but definitely need to be able to provide something to help enterprises survive. And finally, I think given my situation, definitely something on unpaid care work. I love all the suggestions Deepa has provided. Um, but it has to be linked with employment, right? I mean, I think this very, very important aspect that it should be available for women who need it and when they need it. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Deepa.
I mean, agreeing with everything that Ashwini and Yamini listed out, and it's a bit of a repetition. But the first thing which they're also saying is that government needs to spend. Spend on whatever, but spend on micro enterprises. Like open the treasury, spend money, because that is where there is a problem now. And we have this situation where you have a slowdown. You also have prices going up, the pulses, oils, and so on. So they really need to put money out. Short and medium term, there's so many things they can do. Just to add again what we said, first is the food schemes, because there you have the grains and you have the money. You have everything sitting with you. You just need to distribute it. There is again more than 100 million tons of food grains in the FCI go downs this month. And along with that, midday meal, ICDS, Narega, and so on. The second, I would say, frontline workers, give them at least during these COVID months, they're going to have additional work for vaccines, and everything else. So the State of Working India report has said 5,000 rupees a month. That needs to be done. Along with that, I think this would come in medium term, because we've been waiting for very long, is to fill all the vacancies of the supervisors, the CDPOs, the ASHA facilitators. There are huge vacancies, over 30% in all of this. So filling all of those. Third, I think some kind of wide-ranging cash transfer, including all these DBT schemes that the central government runs. So enhancing the amounts, because the response we always get in that is that, oh, we would like to do a cash transfer, but who do we pay? You pay all your pensioners. You have widow pensioners, you have single women, you have old people, you have disability pensioners, you have school SC/ST scholarship holders. You have so many lists. Just transfer some amount into their accounts. And the last, which all of us talked about, is put the data out on all of this, so that there is some amount of transparency and independent monitoring of what is going on.
Soumya, I think there are two questions by Prabha.
Yeah, I was about to just raise them. In fact, that comes back to a point that Yamini had raised. How do you, these are great suggestions. I think all of us every 2 weeks reconvene in different panels and keep raising them. So I don't know if that would make sense. And Yamini, if you think perhaps, we could probably do like a convening, and maybe it might not be a bad idea to actually put out a collective call to action, which could really be a substantial piece. I mean, all of us have been writing on all of these issues, and of course the media takes it up, but then the media is taking up things and it doesn't help, and also I think in that call to action, the micro set of issues that Yamini were talking about, that, how do you actually translate into the rural areas, what are the roles that CRPs, etc. are playing. So, I mean, maybe that might actually be a good thing to do. And I think the other question that Prabha had was on litigation. and whether that actually makes sense to actually provide relief measures to get the space, if at least the Supreme Court seems to be listening in matters more actively now. So does that make sense? Or at least an evaluation of the policy spaces that have opened up, like, the new Social Security Code, or if not, a litigation, or so any thoughts on both of those?
On litigation, I could just share that, I mean, litigation has been quite a hit and miss space. So, but we have got, there is, Supreme Court is so moto hearing this whole on vaccines, but in that case, some of our friends had intervened and we did get orders for instance, rations for migrant workers. But again, that's interpreted the way the state wants to. So it's migrant workers, and now we've gone into, again, how do you know that somebody is a migrant worker before they can get it? So obviously, when Supreme Court makes policy, then there are issues as well. But of course, high courts and Supreme Courts, Delhi High Court, through the last lockdown, played a very positive role. The same court, the same case this time has been hugely disappointing. So it's a hit and miss. It's another space that we need to try, I think.
Anyone else? Yamini, Ashwini? Okay. But thank you so much. It's been a pleasure listening in, and really some food for thought on what might be done. And we'll reconnect with each of you individually again. But really, thank you for everyone for joining. And it was really, I really enjoyed myself, and I had a very interesting discussion, learned a lot from the three of you. So thank you so much for joining in, and thank you for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, and thanks to the audience for joining.
Yeah, thank you.